All right. Next, we have Dr. Meryl Alpert. She's an assistant professor of communication studies at Northeastern University and a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Dr. Alpert studies and teaches about the social implications of communication technologies with a focus on youth and families, disabilities, and mobile media. She's the author of Digital Youth and Disabilities and Giving Voice, Mobile Communication, Disability, and Inequality. Prior to joining the faculty at Northeastern, she earned her doctoral master's degree from the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California, and a bachelor's degree in communication studies and history from Northwestern University. In her research and teaching, Dr. Alpert also draws on her professional experience in educational children's media as a researcher, strategist, and consultant with Sesame Network, Workshop, PBS, Nickelodeon, and Disney. I'd like to have you all please welcome Meryl Alpert. Thank you.
So welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our organizers for today. My talk today is on reconsidering connection and conversation through disability and communication technology. So I would say that I'm sort of a social scientist with a humanistic bent. I use ethnographic and historical methods to study the social and cultural implications of communication technologies, and particularly in the lives of young people with disabilities. So this is sort of one historical moment I'm really interested in. This is in the kind of tech magazine Commodore Power Play back in 1984. It says, using language of the time, handicapped kids are computing too, as opposed to all other children enjoying the dawn of personal computing. I'm really interested in how disability fits into communication research, but more importantly, how the very study of communication might be improved by incorporating disability. With notable exception from scholars such as Gerard Goggin, if you're familiar with any of these folks, Jonathan Stern, Mara Mills, and Elizabeth L. Sesser, there's been relatively little reflection in my field of communication on what the social, cultural, and technical practices of disability can add to our core ideas of communication. So in my presentation, I'm going to focus on one such contribution: how the study of mobile media and mediated interpersonal communication can better reflect the use of portable communication technologies like this one, used by individuals with speech disorders. So this device is called a springboard light, produced by assistive technology company PRC. As I have the little laser? Yes, I have the laser. Okay, great. So what you would do is you would press any one of these kinds of buttons up here. There's icons, there's letters, there's sort of folders that take you to more sets of these, and you would construct a sentence of some kind. It would populate this white area up here, and then you would press it, and the speech would output where the speaker is on this mobile communication device. But in this instance, it would say, "I have something to tell you," which I think is a pretty fitting way to begin my talk with you all today. So over the course of 16 months, from 2012 to 2014, I studied how 20 young people, ages 3 to 13, in the greater LA area, each with significant speech impairments due to developmental disabilities such as autism and cerebral palsy, use speech-generating devices for communication. And these devices have increasingly moved beyond the springboard light and taken the physical form of iPads, as pictured here. My research centered on how users, their parents, siblings, and extended families made sense of the new routines that these technologies introduced into their lives, the meanings that they ascribed to these technologies, and to the culture around them, the culture around Apple, the culture around sort of assistive technology writ large. So I observed families being trained at home by speech pathologists who are also assistive technology experts on how to use these devices together. I interviewed parents. I conducted additional field work, such as attending parent workshops on how to understand these very complex pieces of software, interviewing school district staff and administrators whose responsibility it was to manage these systems as well. So as Jesse mentioned, this work has found its way into a few pieces of writing thus far. One is my recent book, Giving Voice, published by MIT Press. Also, I'll toot my own horn slightly, the recent winner of a Prose Award, which I'm very proud of. And then also a book chapter I've got coming out from the Routledge Companion to Disability in Media. I've undertaken this work on technology, connection, and conversation against the backdrop of concerns that the overuse of smartphones and networked mobile devices limit the ability of individuals to make eye contact and develop empathy for others. For example, in her most recent book, Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age, MIT professor Sherry Turkle implores her readers to repair their relationships by reclaiming conversation from the overpowering grasp of their graspable technologies. Popular claims of mobile media's direct and negative effects on human connection have not gone unchallenged. Scholars such as Nancy Baim, Dana Boyd, Mimi Ito have repeatedly demonstrated that kind of digital dualism, a dichotomy of sorts between devalued technological, mere chatter on one side and valued human conversation on the other, misrepresents the complex relationships that individuals negotiate through and with new media. Now, with that being said, though, what has been less subject to scrutiny is how moral panics about mobile technologies and the demise of conversation fundamentally, I would argue, concern issues of ability and disability. So take Turkle's image here on the front cover with its slightly angled red chairs. This tableau reproduces physical standards about how two people should best position their bodies in a conversational setting. Those red chairs remind me of this image from the illustrated children's classic, The Little Golden Book of Words. When I see those two chairs, I think about the way the ideal conversationalist is displayed, much like this boy, who can sit up straight in a wooden chair without accommodations, like a seat cushion or assistance from another person. His body parts align straight to support his trunk, his neck, and his head. He effortlessly engages in eye contact with others. In short, the ideal conversationalist is of able body, able mind. This privilege, though, isn't just evident in Turkle's cover image, but in how she writes about the seductive qualities of machines with voices, such as Apple's artificially intelligent assistant, Siri. Turkle explains that during our evolution, the only speech we heard was the speech of other humans. Now, with the development of sophisticated artificial speech, we are the first humans asked to distinguish human from non-human speech. Neurologically, she says, we are not set up to do this job. What Turkle is saying here, sort of vaguely alluding to evolutionary biology, is that mobile communication and authentic conversation are antithetical. And moreover, that embodied oral speech is fundamental to the human experience. But what about people who communicate primarily through said machines with voices, whose bodies do not conform to those red wooden chairs? The most famous of these individuals is the late Stephen Hawking, pictured here. But the American Speech Language Hearing Association reports that at least 2 million Americans have an impairment of some sort that limits their ability to talk in the traditional sense. Those who are unable to or have significant difficulty talking supplement their capacity for speech through tools and strategies known in the clinical world of speech-language pathology as augmentative and alternative communication, which sort of ironically is a mouthful to say. So sometimes I'll refer to it as AAC. Individuals with developmental disabilities like autism, acquired disabilities such as those resulting from a stroke, or degenerative disabilities like ALS use these systems to augment any existing oral speech they might be able to use, or as an alternative to it altogether, as in the case of Hawking. So that's where the augmentative and alternative come from. In the rest of my talk today, I want to make a case, though, that all mobile communication technologies, in some way, augment or serve as an alternative to embodied oral speech. Be it the sending and receiving of texts typed by fingers into the keyboard of a mobile phone, or Hawking's delivery of a presentation typed into a keyboard mounted onto the arm of his wheelchair. Both involve mobile communication that bypasses the bodily production of oral speech. I thus propose situating mobile communication practices along a spectrum of what I'm calling communication augmentations and alternatives, sort of flipping AAC a bit. Individuals with speech disorders may rely more centrally on an array of mobile media, as well as human and non-human resources in order to talk. But by subverting the normative structures used to classify human dependence on communication technology, I believe that we can better account for the disabled experience as an innately human one. So I'll start off by providing a fuller explanation of AAC and how it functions as a mobile communication technology. There's a lot more than just the Springboard Lite and the iPad for us to talk about. Next, since the discussion of AAC, actually a raise of hand, who here had heard of AAC before you stepped into this room? So a smattering. Okay. So it's largely confined to the field of speech pathology, but I want us to unpack a little bit more about what that communication means. Then I'm going to ground my conceptualization of communication augmentations and alternatives with two cases from my fieldwork. And lastly, I'll conclude by suggesting some new approaches to the social study of technology that are opened up, I would say, by the reframing of mobile communication through communication augmentations and alternatives. Before going further, I think it's really important to both provide an audio-visual example of what I'm talking about, and also to have young people with disabilities speak for themselves on the role that these mobile communication technologies play in their lives. So Apple published this short video on YouTube back in 2006 for Autism Acceptance Month, which is April, entitled Dillan's Voice, with a young AAC user named Dillan. And so we're going to watch this video together. And as you watch it, I want you to keep in mind one question. And that question is, what technology does Dillan use to communicate? So with that, I'm going to signal folks back there to set our video in motion. We can make that large. Awesome.
My name is Dillan, and I am autistic. All my life I wanted so badly to connect with people. But they couldn't understand, because I had no way to communicate. I get to experience the world in a very unique way. I can see the wind, hear the flowers. I can feel incredible emotions flowing from those I love.
twin apart, a twin apart. This man, no.
Many.
So many, so many, so many.
So many people can't understand that I have a mind. All they see is a person who is not in control. But now you can hear me. The iPad helps me to see not only my words, but to hold on to my thoughts. Having a voice has changed everything in my life. No more isolation. I can finally speak with the people that love me. I can say what I think and let them know I love them too.
Hi, Dylan.
Hello, my name is Dillan. We are the reality of our thinking life, and are capable of so much if we just open our minds.
We're gonna close that because it's gonna play otherwise. So, open question here to you all. What technology does Dillan use to communicate? Sort of interactive portion of the talk. What technology does he use?
It's mine.
We'll table if that's a technology or not.
It's not. It looks like he's just typing away on a standard keyboard. It doesn't look like he has massive assistive, like whole words or anything like that set up for him. So it doesn't look that much different from what I use.
So we'll get to that. So it doesn't look that different. You say keyboard, iPad, speaker.
English.
You can say if language is a technology, potentially. Touch screen. So I want to expand and push our definition of what technology is here a bit. I would say that other technologies here that are quite central, at least what I found in my field work, so the case itself is a kind of technology that's really important. You might notice here the stack of binders and notebooks that are part of this larger assemblage of what Dillan is using. You might also notice right here there's a kind of a plastic dinosaur. It's used as a fidget tool, help him focus on what he's trying to communicate. He has, I think a degree of social, cultural, and economic support, some material resources that are not evenly distributed among all individuals who are non and minimally speaking. And I don't have it in this picture here, but his therapist next to him, as a sort of guiding force in his communication, also serves as a kind of extended technology to enable him to communicate beyond sort of his biological attributes. So the world of AAC is much broader than what's even represented in that video. There are sort of two basic types of AAC. So it would be aided, which is in the, unaided, which is in the sort of gray box here, as an example, and aided. Unaided AAC systems rely exclusively on one's body to convey a message to another person. This includes non-spoken language, so such as smiling or frowning, non-lexical sounds, so laughs or groans, and potentially sign language as well. So this is sort of to note that ASL is employed by individuals with disabilities beyond just the deaf and hard of hearing community. It serves as a kind of resource here for those who are unable to produce oral speech as another kind of tool. Aided AAC systems differ from unaided ones because they require the use of tools or equipment to convey messages. So this includes digital and non-digital objects, as well as other people to help facilitate communication. So as you can see here, aided AAC systems vary quite a deal in their technological complexity. Low-tech systems, such as this one right here, which is an E-tran, or a sort of an alphabet board, it's cheap, it's simple in design, doesn't require a power source, but potentially another person who serves as a sort of, you might think of this as a sort of very low-tech predictive text system of the person on another side of a clear alphabet board being able to anticipate with a couple different letters what a person might be trying to communicate, and then articulating that on their behalf. There's also sort of battery-powered mid-tech systems that can just store a couple pre-recorded messages. And then, high-tech systems with the sort of ultimate in high-tech being Hawking's system that permit users to type words, select symbols from a dynamic screen with various changing options, and convey many more kinds of messages using digitized or synthesized speech than just a device like this would. Today's high-tech AAC systems also include software that's available on the general marketplace, like the Apple App Store. You don't have to go to a specialty website or a specialty store to acquire these kinds of systems. You could go straight to the App Store. And when you combine them with off-the-shelf hardware, so the iPad or the Apple Watch, they mimic then sort of these more traditional devices like the Springboard Lite. So for example, this is a promotional ad put out by the company Assistiveware, which also produced the software that Dillan uses in that video. And this is an image announcing that one of their main AAC app, Proloquo to Go, is now available for the Apple Watch. And one thing I find really fascinating about this ad is this line right here. Now also for communication. It's a reference here to the Apple Watch as being now also for communication. So I was struck by two things when I saw that line. One was, if the Apple Watch is now for communication, what was it before the introduction of this app? And then two, what do they mean by communication? As a communication, scholar, there's lots of ways in which Apple is bound up with communication sort of in general. So then that required a dive into what in this space does communication tend to mean. And I see, and I've analyzed, having been embedded then in some of these communities of speech pathologists, and having sort of gotten a sense for how the field is developed, there's a couple different ways we can parse this. So first is that in the communication sciences literature, there's a clear influence of the transmission or sender-receiver model of communication. And this model, which was developed at Bell Labs by Shannon and Weaver in the late 1940s through their work on telephony, has had a far-reaching influence on cybernetics, linguistics, communication theory writ large. It characterizes a successful communication act as one in which a message is transferred from point A to point B through channel C with its singular meaning intact. In speech-language pathology, this model informs how language is quantified. So you might think about being able to measure, diagnose, and treat breakdowns in communication when it's measured by number of words, length of sentences, frequency or duration of communication. So the transmission model underlies that. However, as James Carey, kind of a famous theorist in the world of communication, outlined in his landmark essay, A Cultural Approach to Communication, the transmission model is limited in that it does not take into account how social and cultural dynamics shape the meaning of messages, or what Carey termed a ritual view of communication. Drawing on the work of anthropologist Clifford Geertz, and I think Geertz has been mentioned at least once today, Carey wrote, quote, "Communication is a symbolic process whereby reality is produced, maintained, repaired, and transformed." So from this perspective then, AAC is more than just transmission. It involves the exchange of meanings in a given context. For example, in the video, Dillan is taking on a number of ritualized forms, whether it's a graduation speech or he's the one doing the voiceover for the commercial. It's another kind of ritualized form of communication. So in addition to the transmission and ritual views then, a third theory, domestication, developed by Roger Silverstone and his UK colleagues in the 1990s, also underlies the meaning of communication in AAC. Domestication theory posits that since media and communication technologies are material objects with a physical presence, they develop their own biographies, their own kind of stories, as they accompany individuals throughout their lives. People with communication disabilities develop intimate relationships with particular media platforms and AAC systems that they use. And as with Dillan, that could also include, plastic dinosaurs, other kind of assemblages of very intimate technologies. So understanding AAC then as mobile communication requires taking into account these simultaneous understandings of ritual, transmission, object as forming communication. So as with communication, the terms augmentations and alternatives aren't fixed categories either, and their distinctions aren't always clear-cut, hence a sort of spectrum between them. Everyone, including those with or without significant speech impairments, pulls from a repertoire of methods and a range of tools for any of us to fit particular communicative opportunities, which leads to each of us being more or less understood. So any number of factors can constrain a person's ability to communicate solely through spoken language. So this might include environmental factors, having to yell in a loud bar during a football game. That's something that environmentally impacts our ability to be understood just through oral speech. If you're, really kind of tired and you're not kind of articulating clearly, that might affect you, your ability at that given moment. Communicating with somebody maybe who has a different native language than yours might alter your ability to understand one another, or just sort of the cultural norms around having a conversation, so turn-taking. Because of this variability, the International Society for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, or ISAAC, emphasizes the universality of augmentative and alternative communication for all people, not just those who experience impaired speech. The ISAAC explains that, quote, whenever something constrains the effectiveness of our spoken language, we will use an augmentative form. Therefore, the use of AAC is a question of degree rather than difference. Based on my fieldwork, I believe that situating all mobile communication along a spectrum of communication augmentations and alternatives allows for this greater emphasis on relative degree as opposed to just difference. It offers us new ways of seeing beyond the binary of just specialized versus mainstream technologies and towards a more accurate reflection of the multi-layered, convergent, and collaborative uses of mobile communication in everyday life. So I want to draw your attention then to the experiences of two boys from my research, Sam and Pargev, and their mothers, Donna and Karun. These are all pseudonyms. Their stories illustrate how the authenticity of communication, the meaningfulness of conversation, and the intimacy of relationships can't be reduced to the mere presence or absence of mobile media and synthetic speech. So first up, Sam and Donna. So I first met Donna during the coffee break of a small assistive technology conference in Southern California, at which she was a featured speaker on a parent advice panel. Her son Sam, at that point, was 7 years old, an upper middle class white boy with multiple disabilities, including autism and spina bifida. Sam had used the Prologue to Go app initially on the iPad for about a year, but then it switched to a different AAC device known as a Vantage Lite. And so one of those is pictured here. When I interviewed Donna later, she discussed the role of mobile communication in Sam's language development. She told me how kind of each and every night, Sam used his vantage light to speak to his grandmother. She said that Sam, quote, uses FaceTime through the iPhone. We place the phone through the handle of the vantage light so it stands up, and he talks to Grandma and tells her about his day. And so when I asked her, well, where does Grandma live? Fully expecting her to be like, on the other side of the country or, somewhere far, Donna replied, she lives 5 miles away. She explained, quote, they converse, and it's all for practice. It's a nightly ritual that we do. Mobile communication here does not so much degrade an empathetic bond between Sam and his grandma, so much as enable it in the first place. Karun, meanwhile, described how her extended family participated in a similar ritual. This ritual, though, exclusively occurred back in her home country of Syria. Another sort of connection of sorts to our prior speakers. Prior to her husband, and her sons fleeing the ongoing civil war there. And before their departure, Karun was homeschooling her 13-year-old minimally speaking autistic son, Pargev, and taught him what she called communication by mobiles. What does she mean by that? So Karun explained that she used to have Pargev memorize cell phone numbers that she had written down for him in a little address book. She said, quote, we would put mommy's number, daddy's number, grandmother, grandfather's number, all the numbers in that little book. And after Pargev memorized them, Karun wrote each one down on a little scroll of paper, itself a kind of form of mobile media, and she put the scrolls in a basket. And each day as part of his lesson, Pargev had to select one scroll and use the phone to call the number. Like Donna, Karun enlisted then both her social network and the telecommunications network to spread support for her son's language development. And she tasked every member with asking Pargev different questions. Questions like, how are you? What did you do today? Did you do math? Oh, and she kind of said that it's just to make him get used to talking on the phone as kind of her rationale for this practice. Whereas Donna currently found it very easy to implement daily FaceTime chats between Sam and his grandmother, Karun spoke of her family's routine strictly in the past sense. She said wistfully of life in Syria, quote, I used to do things a lot like that over there. But now the family had to live within a much more constrained set of economic, resources. When I met them, there was no income being earned at all. She said, quote, for my husband, he left his own clinic. We left our parents, everything else we left there. Why Sam, Pargev, and their families experience connection and disconnection, kind of part of our theme here, has to do with a lot more than just technology. Their experiences with augmentative and alternative communication complicate neat distinctions between face-to-face and computer-mediated communication. And the conversation acts that I've just described are distributed across both bodies and bodies of water. They use various tools in order to talk, from cell phones to address books to paper scrolls, even though neither is able to fully use oral speech. The instructional practices that Donna and Karun start to kind of conclude and synthesize here, the instructional practices that these moms undertook and their sons and their extended families undertook challenge the idea that oral communication is somehow independent from technology and learned technique as to be reclaimed from it, per Turkel's argument. Anthropologist Jonathan Reno argues that, quote, the very idea of language acquisition implies that speech is something owned, a property that we comfortably possess, rather than a skill that most, but not all, are equipped for, which requires practice and may involve lifelong struggle. What it means for Sam and Pargev to have a conversation cannot be understood outside of technology as well as technique. The lens of communication augmentations and alternatives, thus, I argue, offers a more humane understanding of human communication. Each new mobile technology that any one of us picks up is going to take time, effort, trial, error, and practice to master. What makes AAC systems distinct is not that they're used by people with temporary or permanent communication impairments, but that they generally take more time, repeated effort, waves of trial and error, and consistent practice in order to augment or replace embodied oral speech. And all of this takes place against the context of a largely speaking world. Placing mobile media in conversation with critical disabilities studies scholarship contributes to a larger public dialogue about the tools that give assistance to all human bodies, as opposed to just conceiving of some items as specialized within the mainstream and thus outside of the domain of media and communication studies. Scholars such as Sarah Hendren and Mara Mills have each argued in their respective artistic and historical projects that what makes a technology assistive is largely shaped by the context of its use, as opposed to the intrinsic qualities of the technology or the technology user. As a corollary to their idea that all technology is assistive, I argue that all mobile communication technologies are augmentative and alternative. For the most part, media and communication studies scholars are fairly comfortable with the idea that communication is multimodal and involves different forms of mediation. But our basic models of communication are still not centrally informed by the materialities and imaginaries of disability. New concepts are needed in order to describe the complex relationships between technology, sociality, and embodiment in complex social and technical systems. So this talk has put forth one concept. For Salman Pargev and millions more, speaking occurs quite differently than the norms of speech communication would suggest, using systems known in the field of speech-language pathology as augmentative and alternative communication. When we consider these systems as mobile communication, shaped by considerations of communication as a transmission, as a ritual, as an object, it allows us to reorient our understanding of human expression through mobile devices as existing along a spectrum between communication augmentations and alternatives to embodied oral speech. This new orientation challenges dominant cultural narratives that pit technology and conversation against one another, and the false claim that there is some universalized form of talking and listening that all bodies and minds effortlessly do. Future empirical work on mobile technology, mediated communication, and interpersonal relationships must move conversation about disability from the abstract to the concrete, to truly be in conversation with disabled individuals themselves. This includes how they come to understand the role of technology in their lives, the conditions under which this relationship varies, and how it changes over time and over the lifespan as well, from childhood also into adulthood. As autistic blogger Sarah Luderman writes, people who oppose the use of screens, people who are, put your phones down, why, screens shouldn't be a part of how we communicate with one another. She says they aren't trying to silence disabled people, may not be intentionally ableist. The problem is that they aren't thinking about us at all. Clearly, more critical thought is needed then regarding how it is that people with communication disabilities, many of whose participation in the social and public sphere is intimately tied to mobile devices, might also be intimately tied to platforms like Facebook, before we're all so quick to say, delete it, get rid of it, when some folks are very tied to the communities and networks that those platforms now enable. We have to sort of understand how these systems, and more importantly, how these people are so understudied in the first place. That's it.
Thank you so much. Any questions? I'm interested what you see is there's a lot of adaptation and innovation, but then there's also a lot of retrofitting. Mm-hmm. It's kind of an interesting interplay between using the tools that are there, but those aren't enough, right? I mean, to facilitate the kinds of problems that people have, new things need to be developed. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, that play back and forth between using what's available, like Dillan, but then also creating new ways of communicating.
Yeah, so there's wonderful historical work on the sort of legacy of what scholar Amy Hemry calls cryptechnoscience, of individuals with disabilities basically coming up with innovative solutions, and the technologies for that innovation being, both sort of, materials, but also the resources of one another. So whether that's, projects of adaptability in the built environment, so, including, trying to activism around the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, but also, folks post-war, post-World War II, retrofitting their homes, sort of the original versions of like smart homes, having to be by necessity employed by folks with disabilities who wanted to do things like, read while in bed, and creating, how to manipulate books from one's bed. Bess Williamson is another design historian who's been thinking through how disability is part of design history and product development in the U.S. So there's sort of a rich, and I think there's many more of those histories that need to be recovered, so that it isn't so presentist. I think that's where my social science hat and my humanities hat kind of go on when there's sort of claims about newness when it comes to technology, and I always have like it goes back a little further kind of a thing. But technology tends to bring out the warrants for the arguments are very much about being cutting edge, but without looking at what has that edge been sharpened on, prior.
I think continuing in the historical examples, I was wondering, just as you're pushing the definition of augmentation and assistive, I was wondering also if this project made you rethink, and again, this is not a novel question, like what actually constitutes disability? Because I was thinking of the technology of architecture and how for thousands of years we have been using acoustic design as an assistive technology to allow a voice that has a certain capacity to reach a population that's the unaided voice would be able to reach.
Yeah.
And that essentially makes everyone disabled if they're trying to speak to an audience of 3,000 or 5,000 people. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you've pushed or rethink what actually constitutes disability as well as part of your project.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's different models of disability.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of disability studies like 101 stuff about whether we let medical terminology define what disability is, whether we situate that in the built environment, or whether we potentially think about disability as being something that is kind of formed between people and the political relations, between them. So I think that, my understanding of what disability, even just the language to be used around disability, and for me, kind of mapping the tensions between who uses what terms flexibly and who, and without sort of concern for people who might be defined by those terms and people who, right now my research has taken a shift towards looking at autism in particular. So just referring to somebody as a person with autism versus a person who is autistic, and sort of the power of words, and how that then gets, that idea about who's represented, what terminology do we use, do then efforts around technology get built around, and who it's for and who it's by. So I would say that it becomes hard to unthread my understanding of how disability has changed over time, because as I sort of tried to go back even further in the archives and try to find more about kids with disabilities and their uses of technology, we reached a point where we had a movement, at least in this country, from largely institutionalization to being able to just live at home. And so for me, just to be studying how kids at home use technology and their kids with disabilities, that's a project that I don't know if I could not have done that at the beginning of the 20th century. So there's there has to be a kind of presentness to what I'm trying to do, because it wouldn't have been possible in another era.
Yeah, the reason I answered your question about what technology he was using was because I'm very impressed by the placidity of the human brain, and I was thinking about somebody like Helen Keller, who had all the disabilities, quote unquote, and yet she was able to adapt to that with the help of, some ingenuity. So do you do a lot of study of how she went from totally non-communicating to be a brilliant thinker, writer, you know?
So I'd say that disability is such a large category that that there are people who specialize just in studying sort of blindness or deafness, or it's in the same way that it's to be challenging to ask somebody who studies race or gender to sort of study all aspects of it. But if you're interested in sort of Helen Keller and her role in not just sort of language, but her role in the entire sort of system of telephony, I'm happy to point you towards some articles on that.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I was really struck at the end of your talk with the quote from a blogger with autism. And most of the examples that you talked about today and that are in your book are focused on communication in the home. But I was wondering if you would say a little bit more about people with autism online and how they're connecting to the wider world, right? So there's kind of like a tantalizing hint there about how people with disabilities are able to connect to people outside the home through the internet. I wonder if you could speak a little more to that.
Yeah, I mean, one sort of thread is around activism, and so when we talk about marches, the ways in which that involves a kind of stand uprightness, maybe a kind of endurance, maybe not necessarily a accessibility to the forum of participating in a march. So whether that was kind of the Women's March this year or the march, most recently March for Our Lives, the ways in which some of those virtually have taken place. And with autism, part of that might be related to sensory issues that might come up in a sort of environment like that, and it's just easier to participate in that and richer to participate in a virtual space. So, and all of that is also tied to this long history of disability organizing. So I think that it's like the technology enables a kind of participation, but the marshaling of human resources and of networking has this like deep tradition as well. So it's like the technology enters into that pre-existing space of like trying to put your body where your politics are. Yeah.
Great, we're going to take another short break. Thank you so much.